I never thought I'd find myself in a situation where I was watching an HOA officer draw a taser on my wife. But there I was, standing on my porch, staring in disbelief as the guy aimed it right at her. It was surreal, like some bad movie scene, except this was real life. I had a coffee in one hand and slippers on my feet, still processing how we went from discussing whether we had enough charcoal for a weekend barbecue to a showdown with some guy in a cheap sheriff vest. But before you start asking how we got here, let me tell you, this wasn't some random act of aggression. The guy had no idea who he was messing with. My wife isn't just any ordinary woman. She's special forces. And what he didn't know was that her old unit had been keeping a very close eye on him. Those red laser sights you see on TV. Yeah, they were locked onto his chest. It didn't take long for the situation to escalate. My wife, she didn't flinch, not even when the taser discharged and the electrical sparks lit up the air. I froze, coffee still in hand. Lena, on the other hand, had already processed the entire situation before I could even blink. She'd been through far worse. Meanwhile, me. I was just standing there, trying to comprehend what was happening. But Lena? She saw the power trip coming from a mile away. She didn't react, didn't jump into action. She just let it play out. And honestly, looking back, I'm glad she did. It all started so innocently. We had just moved into Greenbryer Estates 6 months ago, thinking we were getting a peaceful suburban life. The flyer had promised a quiet, secure neighborhood, safe for kids, good schools, no noise, and definitely no wild parties at 2 a.m. The kind of place where you could finally relax and enjoy your life without the constant noise of the city. At least, that's what we thought. The reality. It wasn't exactly as advertised. The houses were identical. The grass was policed, like it was sacred ground, and you'd be slapped with a fine if your trash can was placed out before 7:01 a.m. It was absurd. But we shrugged it off. Lena thought it was hilarious from the get-go, cracking jokes about how the HOA rules were more complicated than some military deployment manuals she'd seen. She rolled her eyes at the notion of some HOA enforcing petty rules. But we thought, hey, it's quiet, decent schools, no late-night EDM blasting from the neighbors. We can deal with it. Little did we know, we were about to be caught in the web of the HOA's overreach. The first clue that things were off was when Lena parked her beautiful matte black military Jeep just 2 inches over the driveway line, barely touching the grass. The next morning, sure enough, a violation notice was slipped under our door. The urgency on that notice was like the world was about to end. I had to laugh. I couldn't help myself. I showed it to Lena, thinking it was a joke. She didn't laugh, not even a little. She took the notice, scanned it, and calmly added it to a folder she kept labeled Greenbryer Absurdities. It should have been my first clue that she was already preparing something. I should have realized that Lena wasn't just dealing with the minor inconveniences of suburban life. She had plans. Enter Carinette, the HOA president. She was, for lack of a better word, a piece of work. If there was one thing that Carinette loved more than power, it was making everyone around her feel like they were under her thumb. She ran the neighborhood like it was a private army, except, instead of camo, she wore pastel sweaters and held a clipboard like it was a weapon. The moment she laid eyes on Lena, she decided she didn't like her. She said Lena gave off aggressive energy and that her very presence was disruptive to community harmony. I remember the first time Lena encountered her. Carinette walked up to us unannounced, a big smile on her face, like she was about to tell us how to live our lives, and started going off about how community harmony begins with visual cohesion. Lena, completely unimpressed, blinked once, then just turned back to tuning her Jeep's suspension. She didn't even entertain the conversation. Carinette was furious. I could see it in her eyes. Lena wasn't intimidated by her. She didn't care about her rules. And that was all it took. The HOA decided that Lena was a problem. A week later, the violations started coming in fast and furious. They hit us with warnings, citations, and complaints that our military Jeep was disturbing neighborhood tranquility. It wasn't just the Jeep, either. They started nitpicking every little thing, even criticizing our lawn for being too green. I wish I was exaggerating, but that's the reality of Greenbryer Estates. Things quickly spiraled out of control. I'd walk outside, and there would be more of those little notices, tucked into the door, warning us about things like non-compliant lawn gnome placement or unsanctioned tree trimming. At first, it felt like we were being pranked, but it was real. And I knew things had hit a breaking point when the HOA decided to step up their game with what they called the Greenbryer Civil Enforcement Division. A fancy name, right? But it was just 5 guys who looked like they couldn't even get into TSA security, dressed in black polos and cargo pants, walking around the neighborhood like they were about to raid a drug cartel. They carried clipboards the size of Bibles, and the cherry on top, they all had fake badges with titles like Code Enforcer and Safety Lead. I remember one of them practicing baton moves in the cul-de-sac like he was auditioning for some low-budget action movie. Lena, of course, didn't flinch. She didn't react to any of it. She just watched them with the kind of calm that only someone who had survived real danger could have. And then, things got weirder. These guys started putting up cameras on street signs, monitoring our every move. They started threatening to fine kids for sidewalk chalk, giving tickets to old ladies whose garden gnomes didn't meet visual harmony standards, and even made a big deal about a neighbor's dog collar being too reflective under the streetlights. The HOA had officially crossed the line from absurd to outright invasive. But what none of these officers knew was that Lena was already collecting information. She was talking to the neighbors, asking the right questions, getting intel from people who were just as fed up as we were. She was quietly building her case. I didn't know it at the time, but this was all part of a much bigger plan. A plan that was slowly coming into focus. And it was only a matter of time before the HOA's overreach came to a head. When they started showing up unannounced, taking pictures of trash bins, measuring the exact height of grass with tape measures, and leaving cryptic notes about porch lights being too bright. It was clear that they thought they had the power to control every aspect of our lives. But they didn't know who they were messing with. Because Lena, she wasn't just a resident. She wasn't just a wife. She was a force to be reckoned with, and she had already started her own quiet revolution. The real trouble started when the HOA formed what they called the Greenbryer Civil Enforcement Division. I'm sure they thought it sounded all official and intimidating, like they were some sort of neighborhood SWAT team. But in reality, it was just a ragtag group of 5 guys who looked like they couldn't pass a TSA security check. They wore black polos, camo pants, and carried oversized clipboards. The whole setup made them look like they were playing dress-up in their dad's old army gear, trying to enforce rules about lawn care with the authority of an actual law enforcement officer. The worst part? They thought they were doing something important. They didn't realize they were just a bunch of wannabe enforcers who had no idea what they were getting into. One afternoon, I watched one of them practicing baton twirls in the cul-de-sac, looking like he was auditioning for a role in some budget SWAT movie. It was bizarre, almost laughable. But Lena, she didn't even acknowledge it. She just looked at them with that quiet calm of someone who had seen real danger and didn't get rattled by fake threats. She'd been through far worse, and these guys didn't scare her. In fact, she was more annoyed by them than anything. I started noticing little things. She'd take longer walks around the neighborhood, ask neighbors questions about their own experiences with the HOA, and I even caught her running cables through our attic at one point. I didn't know it then, but Lena was doing more than just observing. She was gathering information. She was building something. And it was starting to become clear that it wasn't just about our neighborhood's ridiculous rules anymore. She was preparing for something bigger. I didn't know how deep the rabbit hole went until I saw Lena's files. She had started keeping track of everything, every violation, every absurd citation, every petty complaint the HOA had ever thrown at us or our neighbors. She had a binder, a huge one, filled with notes, printed documents, and reports about the HOA's violations. She even had timestamps, footage from doorbell cameras, and printouts from other neighbors who had sent her information. At first, I thought she was just venting, but then I saw how methodical she was about it. She wasn't just dealing with a few angry neighbors or petty HOA enforcers. She was documenting everything like it was the case of a lifetime. And the more I saw, the more I realized Lena wasn't just playing defense anymore. She was going on the offensive. And that's when the HOA really began to escalate. It wasn't enough that they had their civil enforcement division running around. They started putting up cameras on stop signs, threatening to ticket kids for drawing with sidewalk chalk, fining an old lady for having a garden gnome in her yard that didn't meet aesthetic standards. And they even went as far as fining someone's grandmother for having an unsanctioned wind chime in her garden. I mean, seriously? A wind chime? They were grasping at straws now, looking for any excuse to impose fines or assert control. It wasn't about the rules anymore, it was about power. And it was becoming clear that the HOA had no real checks or balances. They were running wild, enforcing ridiculous laws that no one had asked for. But as much as I hated it, I couldn't deny that it was starting to get to the neighbors too. People were fed up, but no one had the courage to do anything about it. Then one day, something even more ridiculous happened. I was in the garage when I saw one of the HOA officers standing in our yard, peering through our windows like he was conducting some sort of surveillance. He wasn't even pretending to check anything. He was just staring through our window, probably hoping to catch us doing something wrong. At that point, I was beyond pissed off. I couldn't believe it had come to this. But Lena, she didn't lose her temper. She didn't yell or get angry. She just calmly walked outside, looked at the guy, and asked him if he wanted to test how well his pepper spray held up against someone who had been tear-gassed 3 times before breakfast. The guy left so fast, I almost felt bad for him. He was practically sprinting down the street, and I couldn't help but think, that's my wife. Lena didn't have to raise a finger. She didn't need to shout or intimidate. She just knew how to handle herself, and everyone in that HOA knew it too. But even after that, things didn't slow down. In fact, the HOA doubled down. They weren't just patrolling anymore. They were putting up cameras, patrolling at all hours, inspecting everything from the height of the grass to the placement of trash bins. The final straw was when they started issuing warnings for things like the exact placement of outdoor furniture or how much sun your lawn received in the afternoon. It was insane. It was like they were trying to control the entire neighborhood. But what none of them knew was that Lena wasn't just gathering information for fun. She had a plan, and when it all came to a head, no one was going to know what hit them. And that's how we found ourselves hosting a casual 4th of July barbecue, which, if you know anything about the HOA, was far from casual. Lena, of course, parked her Jeep right in front of the HOA's giant obnoxious sign that read, "Aesthetic compliance is a civic duty." I knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't hiding it. She wasn't trying to avoid a confrontation. She was setting the stage. And the moment those HOA officers showed up like clockwork, I knew things were about to get interesting. The Civil Enforcement Division arrived in full force. 5 guys in black polos and cargo pants, looking like they were ready to take on a terrorist cell, not a group of people trying to enjoy some barbecue. They formed up like they were breaching a bunker, complete with body cams and tactical gear. It was almost laughable, but I could see it in their eyes. They thought they were about to take us down. And Lena? She didn't flinch. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, arms crossed in front of her Jeep, waiting for them to make the first move. And when they tried to issue that citation, she didn't back down. She didn't get angry. She just shrugged, a calm, unbothered look on her face, and said, "You're welcome to try." It was a challenge, plain and simple. And that's when one of the officers, the one with the oversized ego and a taser clipped to his belt, made a huge mistake. He didn't just threaten us. He took it a step further. He actually drew the taser. He pointed it at my wife. And that's when everything changed. Before I could even react, the taser fired, and Lena dropped to the ground. My heart stopped. My mind went blank. I couldn't believe it. But as I stood there, completely paralyzed by what had just happened, I saw something that made my blood run cold. I saw those red laser dots. At first I thought I was imagining things. But no, they were real. Laser sights, coming from multiple directions, locking in on the officers who thought they were in control. It wasn't just a few dots either. It was like the whole neighborhood was watching them. My wife wasn't alone in this fight, and the people she had once worked with had already made their move. Lena rolled over, smirked, and said, "You need to recalibrate your aim. That shot was low and left." That's when I realized this wasn't some random altercation anymore. This was the moment things were going to change. For everyone. The HOA had crossed the line, and now it was time for them to pay the price. As the officers stood there, unsure of what to do, the mood of the entire block shifted. The moment that taser hit my wife, it was like the neighborhood collectively held its breath. For a second, everything seemed to freeze. The neighbors who had been lounging in lawn chairs, casually chatting, suddenly stopped mid-conversation, their eyes wide as they looked from Lena to the officers. No one said anything, but you could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. Lena was on the ground, but even as she dropped, there was no panic in her face, no fear. She just rolled over, almost casually, as if she'd been through this type of thing 1,000 times before. She wasn't a woman to be messed with, and now the entire neighborhood was about to see that for themselves. And then it happened. A flicker of red lights appeared, and before anyone could even process what was going on, more red dots followed. The laser sights were on the officers, sharp and controlled, pinpointing their every move. I couldn't even begin to describe the feeling. 1 second it felt like Lena was at the mercy of these so-called HOA enforcers, and the next, it was clear that they were the ones under surveillance, like they were the ones being hunted. The officers looked around, confused, and in that confusion, their postures began to change. Their earlier bravado started to drain away, replaced by a quiet understanding that they were out of their depth. The laser sights weren't just from a few backyard cameras or from the bushes. They were coming from every direction, across the street, from behind fences, from the roof of our garage. Lena's old team had already positioned themselves, methodically and silently, like professionals who had done this before. They were everywhere, but they weren't there to attack. They weren't there to start a fight. They were simply watching. Lena's voice cut through the silence as she got up, brushing the dirt off her jeans. She turned to the officer who had fired the taser and said, with an almost playful tone, "You need to recalibrate your aim. That shot was low and left." There was no anger in her voice, no fury. It was just a statement of fact. And in that moment, I knew things were no longer about the petty HOA rules or the ridiculous fines. It was about something much bigger, something much more important. The officers stood there, frozen, not sure how to respond. You could practically hear the wheels turning in their heads, trying to figure out what to do next. And I knew that they were starting to realize that they weren't the ones in control anymore. Lena didn't even break a sweat as she yanked the taser prongs from her shirt. She was cool, calm, and collected, like she had handled worse situations before, like this was just another day in her life. The taser officer's hand trembled slightly, and he dropped the taser, almost involuntarily. He had no idea who he was dealing with, and as much as I wanted to jump in to defend my wife, I knew better. I could see the way the other officers were starting to retreat, their posture shifting from one of dominance to one of hesitation. One by one, they started taking a step back, realizing that they were in over their heads. Lena's team wasn't making a move. They weren't walking toward us. They weren't rushing to her aid. They were standing still, observing. They were waiting for something. And I had a feeling that this wasn't going to end how the HOA officers thought it would. And then, out of nowhere, a man appeared at the edge of the crowd. He wasn't one of the officers, but he walked with a kind of quiet authority. I didn't recognize him at first, but when he spoke, everything clicked. He introduced himself as Agent Walker from the Department of Justice, the Office of Civil Enforcement. I almost couldn't believe it. For a moment I thought it was some kind of joke. But no, this was real. Agent Walker walked straight toward the HOA officers, his expression serious but calm, and without a single ounce of hesitation, he began speaking. He didn't address them with anger, but with quiet authority. He calmly explained that the HOA had been operating illegally for months, issuing unlawful citations and fines, creating an armed task force without any kind of legal oversight. He mentioned the cameras, the harassment, and the fact that their whole operation had been under surveillance for some time. You could see it in the officers' faces, complete disbelief. This wasn't the neighborhood power struggle they thought it was. This was something much bigger, and now they were the ones caught in the crosshairs. As Agent Walker spoke, the other members of Lena's old team began to step forward, quietly and professionally. It wasn't an aggressive approach, and it wasn't meant to intimidate. It was more like they were gently ushering the crowd back, making sure things didn't escalate further. But it was clear to everyone around us that this wasn't just some casual neighborhood dispute. This was a full-blown investigation. And the HOA? They were the ones in trouble. The officers looked at each other, clearly confused and unsure of how to proceed. Agent Walker continued, explaining that the HOA's actions were no longer a local issue. They were a federal one. And the further he went, the more the officers realized how deep they were in it. They were the ones who had broken the law, and they had no idea how much trouble they were about to be in. Then, Lena did something I wasn't expecting. She turned to the officers and said, "I've been documenting everything. All of it. Your fines, your surveillance, your little task force. It's all here." She pulled out a thick folder from her bag, one I hadn't noticed before, and handed it to Agent Walker. Inside that folder, every violation the HOA had ever issued, every piece of evidence they had gathered against them, including footage from the hidden cameras, testimonies from other residents, and a trail of corruption and harassment that had gone on for far too long. The whole thing was airtight, and the moment Lena handed it over, I knew it was over for the HOA. The officers were finally starting to grasp the situation, but they didn't fully understand it yet. Lena wasn't just some angry neighbor fighting back against a broken system. She was a woman with an army behind her, and she had been planning for this moment for months. And what was truly wild? She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout at them. She didn't need to. She just stood there, calm and composed, letting the paperwork do the talking. It was one of the most powerful things I've ever seen. That's when things got even more intense. The sound of sirens in the distance grew louder, and I could see the HOA officers beginning to panic. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected someone to fight back, let alone a woman with a network of former operatives behind her. Agent Walker didn't flinch. He stood there, unwavering, as he explained that the situation had already been escalated to federal jurisdiction. The people who had been running the HOA had no idea what they'd just stepped into. And when Agent Walker finally turned to Karinette, the HOA president, I saw the blood drain from her face. He asked her if she was the one who had authorized the creation of the Civil Enforcement Division, the one who had green-lit the creation of a paramilitary force in the neighborhood. She stammered, trying to hold her ground, but it was obvious. She was completely out of her depth. Agent Walker made it clear. "Ma'am, you're under investigation for fraud, harassment, and abuse of authority." Carinette was speechless. She didn't know how to respond. She didn't have a leg to stand on. The investigation was already happening, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The officers who had tried to intimidate Lena, the ones who had tased her, were now the ones facing consequences. The group of clipboard-wielding wannabe enforcers who had once patrolled the neighborhood like they owned it were now on the receiving end of an investigation that would change everything. And as Carinette and the rest of the HOA board members were escorted away by federal agents, I realized just how badly they had miscalculated. They thought they could control the neighborhood, impose their rules with unchecked power. But they had underestimated one thing. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Lena wasn't just a force of nature. She was a storm waiting to happen. And when the HOA pushed her, they had no idea what was coming for them. The best part? Lena wasn't done yet. The neighborhood felt different after that day. It was like the entire atmosphere shifted. The agents had left, the officers had been cuffed, and Carinette was nowhere to be seen. The once feared HOA task force that had terrorized us all was dismantled, and the community was left with a strange sense of quiet relief. There was no more patrolling, no more ridiculous citations for things like lawn gnome placement or the aesthetic integrity of your mailbox. People had begun to talk more openly, sharing their stories about the harassment they'd endured, and it was clear. This wasn't just a few isolated incidents. It was systemic. Everyone had been affected in one way or another, and now we had a chance to rebuild, to take back the neighborhood from the tyrannical grasp of the HOA. But that wasn't all that happened. As much as the neighborhood began to breathe easier, there was still a question hanging in the air. What now? What would happen to Greenbryer Estates after the dust had settled? For weeks, the streets had been filled with whispers about the future. Some neighbors started gathering in small groups, discussing how the HOA had overstepped its boundaries, how they'd been subjected to unfair fines, and how no one had been brave enough to challenge them until Lena came along. What they didn't know, what none of us knew, was that Lena wasn't just content with defeating the HOA. No, she had a much bigger idea in mind. And it wasn't about revenge. It was about reconstruction. The first sign that things were changing came in the form of an emergency community meeting. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured it was just another routine gathering where the neighbors would voice their concerns and ask questions about the future of the neighborhood. But when Lena mentioned to me that she was going, I knew it wasn't just a typical meeting. Something big was coming, and I could feel the tension building in the pit of my stomach. When we arrived, the usual group of neighbors was there, but this time, there was a noticeable shift in the energy. The room was filled with a quiet anticipation, as if everyone knew that this meeting would decide the future of Greenbryer Estates. The most surprising part? Lena was nominated to take over as the new HOA president. Now, I know what you're thinking. How could anyone possibly suggest Lena for that position after everything that had just happened? After the entire board had been taken down, after the tyrannical rule of Carinette and her enforcers had been exposed. The thing is, Lena didn't run for it. She didn't make a big speech or shake hands. She didn't campaign, didn't promise to lower fines or fix things overnight. She simply stood up, accepted the nomination with that calm, almost nonchalant smile of hers, and sat back down. It was a power move in the purest sense. She didn't have to sell herself to anyone. She didn't have to convince anyone that she was the right person for the job. They knew. They all knew. And what followed next was a complete dismantling of the old system. The old rulebook, gone, shredded, in front of everyone. It was a symbolic act, sure, but it was also a message. There was no room for the petty rules, the oppressive fines, or the authoritarian approach that had defined the HOA's reign. Lena's first act as president wasn't about playing nice or making deals with the old guard. It was about tearing down everything that had been built on fear and control. She didn't just want to fix things. She wanted to start fresh. And that meant burning the old rulebook and creating something that was built on respect, transparency, and community. The residents of Greenbryer Estates had been living under a cloud of fear for too long, and Lena was ready to change that. But it didn't stop there. After the old system was dismantled, the real work began. Lena made it clear that there would be no more fines for minor infractions, no more surprise inspections, no more visual cohesion nonsense. The community would run on mutual respect, where everyone had a say in the decisions that affected them. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be bumps along the way, no doubt. But Lena wasn't interested in making things easy. She was interested in making them right. She didn't just want to be the one in charge. She wanted to bring the neighborhood together, to restore a sense of trust and cooperation. And then came the most surprising moment of all, the second community meeting after Lena's election. It was supposed to be a routine follow-up. The HOA had been dissolved, and the residents were supposed to meet and discuss what came next. But that's when things took an unexpected turn. The meeting was barely underway when someone raised their hand and asked the question everyone had been too afraid to ask for years. What happened to the old HOA members? Karinette, the task force, the people who had caused all the damage. There was a murmur of agreement throughout the room, as if the entire neighborhood had been waiting for someone to ask it. Lena stood up, her calm demeanor unchanged, and smiled. She didn't need to say much. She simply explained that the old board members were being investigated for their actions, and that they would face the consequences of their illegal behavior. But what struck me the most wasn't the answer she gave. It was the way she handled it. She didn't get caught up in the drama. She didn't rant or get emotional. She just calmly explained what was happening, and in doing so, she reassured everyone that this was the end of an era. The old guard was gone, and now, it was time to rebuild. Lena didn't gloat. She didn't throw a victory party. She didn't even acknowledge the victory as anything more than the first step in what she had planned. She went back to business as usual, quietly reorganizing the community and making sure that everything was on track. There was no sense of triumph, no celebration. It was like she knew that the real work was just beginning. But I knew her well enough to understand that she wasn't done. Not by a long shot. One of the most powerful moments of the whole ordeal came when Lena looked at the group of neighbors who were slowly coming to terms with what had happened, and quietly said, "We're not just rebuilding a neighborhood, we're rebuilding trust, and that starts with each of us. We can't let what happened here happen again. We can't let fear and control ever take root in Greenbryer again." It was a simple statement, but it carried so much weight. This wasn't about getting back at Karinette or the HOA. This was about creating a community where people were respected, where they had a voice, and where they didn't have to live in fear of being targeted by some self-appointed enforcer. It was about taking back control, not just of the neighborhood, but of their lives. As the meeting ended and the neighbors began to disperse, I saw it in their faces. Something I hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. For the first time since we moved in, Greenbryer didn't feel like a place of oppression. It felt like a place where things could actually change. And it was because of Lena. In the days that followed, life slowly returned to normal. The oppressive atmosphere that had once hovered over Greenbryer lifted, and the streets seemed quieter, more peaceful. The residents were no longer afraid to speak up. The HOA was gone, and in its place was a new chapter. Lena didn't bask in her victory. She just carried on, quietly overseeing the transition, making sure everything was running smoothly. She didn't need to boast. She didn't need to throw herself a party. She was content knowing that she had changed the course of the neighborhood's history, and that was enough for her. But as I watched her interact with the neighbors, I couldn't help but feel proud. Proud of her strength, her calm, and her determination to do what was right. And when she turned to me one evening and said, "It's not about revenge, it's about rebuilding," I knew that Greenbryer Estates had been forever changed, and so had we.